Okay, everybody, thanks for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Anders, but as always, you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me, I have Elijah Adefope. He's a great writer on Substack here, and he does everything from covers like music industry stuff to business and just a lot of really interesting and insightful writing. So with that as a little bit of a teaser, Elijah, do you want to tell the audience a little about yourself, your writing, your background, and we'll jump into it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Glad to be here. Thank you for the invite. Like you said, my name is Elijah Adefope. Uh, my writing, my writing a lot of times the way I would describe it, I think largely for me it's exploratory. It helps me. I think a lot of writers can probably say this. It helps me think and see more clearly when I
Mhm.
write. What I write about, you're right, it does cover everything from music to media to technology, software, and business in general. And I think also just, I wouldn't say I dive into quote unquote life coaching, but I think I touch on some of those topics that might not neatly fall within any of those previous sectors as well. And it's really just a byproduct of my career, and I think my career journey, which we can maybe get a little bit into later on. But it, it does span music, it does span media, it does span technology, and in the nonprofit sector as well.
Mhm. No, it's super interesting, and again, that's part of why I started following you. Initially, it was for a lot of the music stuff because I'm a big, I guess, audiophile music fan myself, and then digging into some of the other stuff that you did. You're a very insightful guy. So I guess the first question I want to ask and jump into a little bit is you've talked about your experience being an immigrant, and I'm sorry, was it from where was it your family's from?
Nigeria.
Nigeria, that was right.
Yep.
Yeah, and I it's something that I've been writing about and thinking about a lot lately, the immigrant experience. Since it occurred to me I've had a lot of just by happenstance really of people I invite on who I find interesting, who are like first or second generation immigrants from like India or Romania or Kosovo, and it's something that's interesting to me to see. The immigrant experience and what your impression was, because even just for example, for a framing device, like my parents are from the US, but we lived in Canada, and I moved from Canada to the US in early 2001. And like when I first came here, for example, like 9/11 happened just a couple months later. So
Oh,
for me it was Canada and the U.S. are very similar in a lot of ways, but there's definitely some differences. And that culture shock of that era of hyper patriotism and all that. To me, it was a very strange thing to experience from the
mm,
outside. Which is to say, I feel like the immigrant experience is part of what I think of it is so valuable is you can provide an outsider perspective, and especially somebody like you. It sounds like you came here when you were young, so you grew up and you're an American as far as I'm concerned, but you have that still a little bit of that outsider perspective. So I'm curious what that was like for you. Your thoughts on American culture, because I've talked to, like I said, people from all sorts of different countries, and I always find that so interesting that that perspective that brings.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing that I would say, uh, I didn't know that about your background, but I think it makes sense because I have noticed some of that outsider perspective from your writing and your viewpoints as well. I think one of the initial things that struck me about some of the things that I've seen you write, uh, number one is I think your grasp of historical trends and how that plays out in modern day, which to me, I'm always impressed by people who can kind of recall these historical facts and figures and dates and individuals because the way my mind works, uh, I wouldn't say I have the strongest rote memory, right? And so I'm always impressed by people who do. And so that's something that has always struck me about your writing. In
Thank you.
addition, absolutely, in addition to the outsider perspective that you mentioned, which I think is probably the hallmark of the immigrant experience, right? And the immigrant mentality, and I think is one of the reasons why I have a lot of friction, I think, with a lot of the modern day conversation, which I think can be very insular. I think the benefit of the immigrant mentality and experience is it does allow you to see uh, from the outside. It does allow you to see from a different perspective, and I think that's tremendous. I think that adds tremendous value, personally, even in career and professionally as well. It's funny because I run a nonprofit that's geared towards professional development for young men. So I'm actually that's why I was late for this because we had an event this morning, and it's one of the things that I was telling them is that coming from Nigeria, moving here, it's I don't fluently speak the native language, right? And there's hundreds, probably thousands of tribes in Nigeria, disparate languages. My family, my parents are Yoruba and Igbo, two specific tribes. I don't speak either of those languages fluently. I can pick up certain things, but I don't speak it fluently. I came here when I was young. And it's interesting because what that's done is it's made me a bit of an outsider in multiple communities, right? So
Mhm.
I'm Nigerian. Obviously, I consider myself Nigerian, but I was also raised an American, consider myself American as well. But in you know certain circles, certain Nigerians might not view me as being fully Nigerian simply because I don't speak the language fluently. Similar to being in America, um, certain circles, whether it's Black Americans, may not consider me to be fully Black American, right? Because I was born in Nigeria. I'm Nigerian by heritage. My family's Nigerian, and I'm obviously not Caucasian, right? And so, growing up
Mhm.
in America and kind of being an outsider and not necessarily belonging to any one particular group, at least from certain perspectives, that's allowed me to see things that others may miss. It's also allowed me to see similarities, which to me, I think is just the biggest benefit and biggest advantage. I think oftentimes, we're, especially the times that we're living in when you're seeing what's going on, whether it's in politics or government, and some of the, I guess, uh, some may call it protectionist initiatives or even civil rights or what's going on in DEI, it causes a lot of angst. It causes a lot of debate, a lot of friction, a lot of just fights, right? Twitter beef, online
Mhm.
beef, like all of these things, right? And a lot of it is because it's the best way I can simply put it. I always tell people that culture um, culture is almost inextricably tied to identity, right? And so when you grow up in a certain, whether it's city or country, you grow up in a certain culture, that culture in a lot of ways becomes your identity. And so when we talk about a lot of these issues and and even when we attack some of these issues that may be byproducts of culture, the result is that the individuals on the other side feel personally attacked, right? Because they take it as you're attacking their identity, who they are, who their family is, where they come from. I mean, you see this in conversations about, for example, the Confederate flag, right?
Mhm.
A lot of debate happens around that issue, but I think some people sincerely believe that that is a part of their culture, and so when you attack some of these things, some of these symbols, they take it personally. And so for me, being an immigrant, having this outsider's perspective, I'm able to see some of these things, I think, more clearly than others would have. But I'm also able to see the similarities. I'm also able to see the similarities between groups. I'm also able to see trends between groups and understand and identify commonalities, which I think helps me not only relate to people, but it also helps me professionally and in my career as well. So I don't get as hung up as others might be on certain issues, simply because I have an understanding of why that's happening, why they feel or see that way. But also have an understanding that that's not only native to them. Other people, operate
Mhm.
the same exact way, but maybe in different expressions. So simply put, I think that's been the biggest benefit. I'm 36 now, so it's been a journey to get to this place. I'm continuing right on this journey as well. So I'm learning all the time. But I think for me, that's probably the best way that I could sum it up.
No, I think that's really succinct, and it's one of the things that really struck me was you're talking about the differences, but also the similarities, right? Because I
Yeah,
remember a while back, you posted something about like how Nigerian moms are, and it's like, damn, to me, it's basically the same thing as like Midwestern moms. Like
yeah,
moms are moms everywhere you go, right?
yep,
But at the
yep,
same time, I think, and you touched on it, it's because I think there is a an instinct to, and I think it comes from a good place to kind of gloss over the differences to be like, oh yeah, we're all the same, man, which to a degree is true. We're all humans, right? We all
yeah,
have, like you said, the same desires and wants, but that's going to manifest differently in
yep,
different cultures, and when different cultures and groups are mixing and bumping up against each other. And you mentioned, even I would imagine, like different tribes in Nigeria, or like see like different Eastern European countries that are physically very close to each other, very culturally similar. Or even I mentioned like Canada and the US are very similar culturally and geographically, but we still have these conflicts. And I think a lot of the times there is this, like I said, this instinct to try to gloss over it in a way that is does a disservice to the problem. And you have to actually be honest about how different groups of people can be different. And then, I mean, once you're honest about the problem and the differences, that's how you can actually begin to start solving the problem. Because I think I've had a similar but different background, that my family moved around a lot when I was a kid. Like when I lived in Canada, it was mostly, it was like a heavily immigrant neighborhood of people from like India, like I guess your standard white Canadians. And it's been so long, it's been 20 some odd years, but there was um not so dissimilar from what we have today. There was like a refugee crisis, and a lot of these refugees were
mm,
resettled in this area of Canada that I lived. So I grew up around that, and then I moved to a smaller town for a little while that was mostly white, and then I moved to Milwaukee, which was like a heavily black area. And I actually grew up in a mostly black area, mostly black school.
interesting,
And my church that my family went to, my dad was the pastor, was like 50% black or so. So it was
interesting.
something that I kind of, like you said, it gives you a different perspective when you're not around just people like you, and you say exactly like you said, it's okay. There are some commonalities, like a mom is a mom, um, people are people, but you do see all these different perspectives and the things that repeat themselves, but also the differences are. And I feel like, at least for me, because I've had these diverse experiences and being around all sorts of different people, and because of what I do for a living, I'm around all sorts of different people. I'm comfortable pretty much with anybody. I can
Yeah,
find some commonality with pretty much anybody, but you also learn, like, I think it's something you can't teach. You just have to learn through experience. And you kind of touched on the DEI thing. And I think sometimes part of what makes people uncomfortable about that is it's like this HRification of these
yeah.
relationships that can be uncomfortable, and you just kind of got to figure it out. At least that's my experience, as far as like the HR side of language policing, that it's uncomfortable, especially in a workplace. And you
I'm
can't teach that.
No, absolutely. I'm curious, man. So, what was that experience like for you growing up in Milwaukee? Growing up, in uh, let's say predominantly black neighborhoods, or attending a church, your family's church, with
Um,
that was 50% black. What was that like? I'm curious.
sure. I mean, if I'm, being completely honest, like it was a mixed bag. It was I know I went from, like I said, it wasn't like my first time being around people who weren't, exactly like me, because
Yep,
I guess I grew up in an immigrant background.
yep.
But it was definitely a culture shock, because I lived in a small town in Michigan, which was basically all white. And then going to that, it was a bit of a culture shock for sure. And something like, and I know there's, the people quibble about the definitions of, racism, power plus privilege, blah, 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 etc. But
Yeah, yeah.
definitely experiencing racism, or at least in the sense, like, I'm being treated differently because of the color of my skin. I
Hmm.
feel out of place because of the color of my skin. My culture is not the dominant culture. So much in the same way, like, there's obviously friction in these situations, but had a lot of great friends, met a lot of cool people, and it gave me that perspective that I feel like a lot of people like me don't necessarily have.
Mm.
Just being able to have that outsider perspective, but at the same time, like it made me like I'm comfortable around pretty much anybody now because of that. Like I've been around all sorts of different type of people. So I mean, funnily enough, the only type of people I generally like feel uncomfortable around is like really like rich bougie white people, because I that's never really been my experience. But you know,
Yeah,
like I said, it's good and bad, you know, because it's it, like I said, it provides you a different type of experience,
yeah,
and a different dynamic, and it makes me, I feel, more sensitive in a way that maybe somebody like me wouldn't normally have.
yeah, man. It's I mean, just immediate thoughts to that. It for me, it I think words are important. You know, I think words are important. For example, and maybe this is me running in front of traffic or into traffic, but you talked about like the definitions of racism and things of that nature, and I know that people you didn't say this, but I know that people say, well, white people can't be racist. Oh no, they say black people can be racist, right?
Hmm.
Because black people, uh, you know, are not the quote unquote dominant quote unquote race, or don't control the systems of power and infrastructure and all of that. I don't agree personally. I think racism is racism. Like the definition of racism is discrimination or mistreatment based on race, right? So I think
Hmm.
anybody can be racist. I think if you want to specify uh, systemic racism, I think that's a different thing. But I always, personally, I always found it kind of illogical to say that black people can't be racist. I think anybody can
Hmm.
be racist, right? Um, Now that's got me to go into back to the topic of being an immigrant. That's gotten me into trouble, and I'm always careful with these conversations when I have them with people now,
Hmm.
because again, as an immigrant and being a quote unquote outsider, you start to learn these differences. Right? We talked about similarities,
Hmm.
but you do start to learn these differences, and a lot of times the differences are not even based on color of skin. Oftentimes they're based on culture.
Hmm.
Because I've had people who were not Black American, but who closely and extremely identified with some Black American, uh, let's say, cultural beliefs, call me an Uncle Tom, and they might have been born in Jamaica, or their family might be Jamaican, right?
Hmm.
Simply because I didn't agree with a specific point that they made, right? And the reason why I say that is because I think oftentimes we gloss over the topic of culture. I think it's a bit of a buzzword in our
Hmm.
day and time, but I do think that oftentimes that's truly what we're talking about. Because like you mentioned, some of the people that you may feel uncomfortable with are these bougie, rich white people,
Hmm.
and it's a conversation we actually had earlier today that I had with the group that I met with, which was the fact that many of these, I think, conversations around race, I think they're kind of remedial uh, sometimes, right? Because
Hmm.
I think oftentimes when we have these discussions, we're not really talking about race. We're oftentimes talking about culture, because not all white people are the same. I mean, I think that's you. I know you know that, right? Like
Hmm.
not all white people are the same. Not all black people are the same. Not all, Asians are the same. So on and so forth. Um, and so I think it's just I think it's a very complex topic, but I do agree that there are differences. I just read this book by, and I wrote a bit about it on Substack. Sorry if there's background noise. I just came to see my parents, but um, I read this book by Alex Karp called The Technological Republic, and one of the things that he talked about was this, this era of quote unquote wokeness, which personally
Hmm.
I hate. We can get into that later, but I'm not
Hmm.
gonna waste time on it. I hate what that whole thing's become. But he really talked about how certain conversations were viewed as off limits, um, and how problematic that was, right? Like how pointing out differences in cultures, was viewed as quote unquote racist or was viewed as
Hmm.
taboo.
Very
And
uncouth.
yeah, man, and I think it's problematic. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is just is the pendulum swinging in the opposite direction. Maybe an overcorrection, but I think a lot of it is just people being fed up with maybe PC culture, being told that they can't talk about certain things. And just to wrap it up, the problem with that is because it's an issue when you try to um, paint people with a broad brush. When you try to correct things by using the same methods that you feel like you were um, victimized or hurt by. You know,
Hmm.
and I think that's a lot of what we're seeing. But to your earlier point, I do think there are differences, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with pointing out differences or even embracing differences. Right? I think uniformity is a boring is a boring aspiration, in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, I would absolutely agree too. And I don't want to hammer this point too hard because I think, look, it's 2025. I feel like the kind of, you touched on it, the cultural zeitgeist has shifted and like the verdict is out. Like, I feel like, whatever you want to call it, wokeness, the hyper politically correct stuff, the
Yeah.
pendulum is swinging again. So I don't want to like hammer that point too hard, but just
Right.
the one thing I would say, there, and I think we've talked about this a little bit on the timeline. Overall, to me, like, I think it came from a good place, and it
Mm,
was something that made sense in context. But like with anything, when it gets taken a hold of by like corporate HR departments and stuff like that, it's obviously going to make people feel uncomfortable, and when people use it very cynically. But my kind of silly, purposely inflaming hot take is, basically wokeness didn't go far enough, and kind of like how you said, like, you need to dig into it more. And like, yeah, there is diversity even amongst these different groups. Like, there is an author that I like. I think she joined Substack recently. She wrote for like Jacobin, named Jen Pan, and she was talking
okay.
about how there was a shift in Asian Americans towards
Mm,
being a Republican. And she's talking about, like, you can't just say Asian Americans anymore,
mm,
because there's just so much diversity within this group. Like, somebody who is an immigrant from China versus Japan versus Korea versus
mm,
Thailand, they have different cultures, different backgrounds, different histories with each other. So
mm.
that's kind of what I mean when I say that. It's I sometimes make jokes like that to be inflammatory, but yeah, like, if anything, like, you need to go farther with it, or let it go. But um, I don't want to dig too far into that unless you have more to
N-
say about it, because I feel like
I mean,
there's
yeah, I mean,
it.
the only thing I would say there
Mhm.
is, I think that, so you said it came from a good place, and I agree,
Mhm.
right? And I'll just say this just to get it off my own chest, right? Like,
Mhm.
for me, the definition of woke has always been just being aware, right?
Mhm.
Being cognizant. Maybe I'll start saying cognizant instead of
Mhm.
woke. But I think that term was used to signify and be a symbol of maybe political correctness, or um, what some felt was just uh, the hallmark of progressives, right? Um, and so for me, I always had like a bad taste in my mouth for the way that word was being used. I mean, it's not like it doesn't keep me up at night, but for me, it's just like, well, guys, that's not really what the word meant, right? But okay, I get it. Now, to what you said, it coming from a good place. I think for me, it's hard to you can't legislate morality, right? Or you can't legislate these types of things. It's hard to create processes and protocols around it. So for me, some of the work that I've done has been with software companies. So
Mhm.
I'm a technology attorney. I do commercial contracts in the software technology space. Oftentimes that involves data privacy, right? I can come up with a privacy policy for how a company should handle personal information and personal data, right? And I can try to implement that. But unless there's buy-in throughout the company, especially at the executive level, it's hard for those policies to be consistently maintained, and it's hard for the spirit of those policies and the data privacy laws to be maintained. And I feel the same exact way about this kind of topic, right? I think ultimately what people want is simply to be heard and to be seen and to be recognized and to feel like they're accepted in, the larger society. I think ultimately that's what this is about. I think that's human, right? And I think
Mhm.
it's also laudable for people to say, okay, how do we actually implement these things? I agree with that. I mean, I'm black, right? Of course. So I agree with that. I think the problem is when you try to create quotas. And I think that's where the friction comes into play. And that's where people start having issues. And I don't have all the answers there, but I think that's one of the problems is how do you actually implement these things in a way that achieves the good, right? But also doesn't cause the same type of harm that it's supposed to alleviate. And I think that's the problem. And I was actually thinking about this earlier. I think for me, sometimes it is just about having conversations, enlightening, educating, right? Not in a way, and I don't use the word educate as like uh, um, in a condescending way, but it's just conversations, right? Having
Mhm.
conversations
Yeah.
with people. And I was thinking about this personally, like I'm pretty sure for me, there's certain things where it comes to women that I probably have a bias about, right?
Mhm.
Just by virtue of being a man, right? There's certain things I wouldn't consider myself sexist, but I'm pretty sure that if someone were to dig hard enough, whether it's with women, whether it's with any race, other races, you could probably find some areas where I am biased or ignorant, right?
Mhm.
Now, for me, I would feel a way if someone made it their sole mission to point those things out, right? If I was having a conversation with someone and their whole point in having a conversation with me was to prove that I'm biased. Well, newsflash, I probably am, but I don't go out of my way to try to, make life harder for anybody or to put myself, you know, over anyone else. And so some of these things simply come through conversations, being enlightened, walking away and saying, you know what, I never realized that, right? So moving forward, let me become more aware or woke, right,
Yeah.
about this issue. And so I think, like I said, I don't, and just one, anecdote. Again, I don't have all the answers, but one anecdote. I was watching this documentary on Apple. It's called, I think it's called Number One on the Call Sheet. It's on Apple TV, and it's great. It just kind of talks about some of the history of Black leading actors in Hollywood, right, and how some of the like real struggles that they went through, um, and to a degree still go through. But one of the things that I actually took away from that was number one, recognizing okay that there are real hurdles. Like one thing that had been told in Hollywood for a lot of years and is still told is that Black movies don't travel, right? Meaning that Black movies don't do
Mhm.
well internationally. And that
China
has
in
been,
particular, I've seen.
sorry?
It's China in particular, I've seen them like edit out black people from like Star Wars movie posters and stuff. And is that kind of what
Yeah,
you're getting at?
yeah, but more so the fact that, that's not, I think China is just, I think they're gonna edit and censor movies in general, right?
Sure.
Um,
Mhm.
but what I was getting at was that that whole thing about Black movies not traveling is not really true, right? I mean, you have examples of Will Smith, right? You have Black Panther, you have Denzel Washington, right? You have Jamie Foxx, and so really showing that to a significant degree, Black movies do travel, and the negative point of that kind of stereotype is that it leads to less funding for actors with for movies with Black actors, right? And so that's like the harm in it. And so that's one of the things that was discussed in this documentary. But my point though was that you know I think we can talk about that and look at that. But one thing that I took away as well was, all right, there have been real struggles, but if I compare movies with Black actors to movies with, let's say, Asian actors or Asian leading men and women, right? Or movies with what's the proper term? Latino leading men and
Mhm.
women, right? Or Indian leading men and women. You know, you don't see as much representation in those groups, I don't think, as you see with black people, right? But I don't hear that conversation as much, right? And so for me, kind of going to the point about being an immigrant, like I think for me, it's simply just being aware of, you know, the things that people go through, you know, some of the fights, the struggles that they may have, and not making it all about yourself, right? And not making the conversation only about yourself, because, you know, there are different groups that also have a hard time with these things, right? Case in point, some of the overcorrection that we're seeing around the conversation is other groups of people feeling left out, feeling left behind as well. And so for me, I just try to be, and again, that's very macro, you know, and you know, some people may say, all right, that's great, but I'm dealing with real, you know, ish on a day-to-day basis as well. What about my problems? But for me, I always tend to look at it from that perspective, because ultimately I think a lot of these things are economic conversations, and that's kind of my lawyer cap. Like when we talk about diversity, all of those things, I don't, for me, it's never about, you know, being diverse or an organization being diverse just to be diverse. I think it's ultimately about understanding that there are areas that have been overlooked, and those areas are opportunities, you know, for growth, right, and to actually achieve the aims that we want to achieve. But I'll just stop there. But that's how I look at a lot of these things, you know, and I try not to just get sucked into the cycle of conversations that have, you know, these debates that kind of have no end. That seem to be circular sometimes. You know what I mean?
I agree 100%, and that's why I try to, both in my personal life and like, you know, on Substack, you see the same conversations happening over and over again.
Man.
And I think people, to a degree, like they like the shadow boxing, I guess. So I just try not to engage in that. Just, you know, because I have better things to do with my time. B,
Right.
I think if I'm going to discuss it, I want to do it like in a context like this, where we're having an honest and respectful and open conversation. You know, and this is something like, you know, this is something we're doing online. But it is, I feel like, difficult. It can be difficult to do in a professional setting. But I don't know. I think it's something that, like I said, these trends have existed for a reason, much in the same way that like the backlash against it existed for a reason. But I'm at least hoping that we're moving in a better direction with it, because one of the few things that I've noticed is, you know, you mentioned when you were in the you know, the legal side of it, because I work in tech, and pretty much universally it was like, other than like some very annoying like HR type of people, pretty much everybody hates the diversity seminar. It doesn't matter if you're black, white, man, woman, Asian, whatever. It just feels very like uncomfortable and unnatural a lot of the times. And I think sometimes it feels like, to me, it's made for people who are, you know, maybe don't have the experience people like you or I have of being around people different than themselves, and they just want like an HR solution to get in front of it so they don't have to have those conversations. But to kind of build on what you're saying and to shift gears ever so slightly, because I think something you said that really resonated with me is you said, yeah, I'm going to have some biases towards, you know, with your interactions with women, for example. And I think realistically, like, we have to acknowledge there's a difference between being hateful and being prejudiced, because I think everybody is prejudiced in the sense that they have biases based on like your own experience. And it doesn't matter what the group, it could even be somebody within your own, you know, quote unquote group. It could be difference in class, upbringing, whatever. So I think that's something that, like, if I would think there's any, you know, way to move forward with this, is like, yes, we've had these conversations, but we've been having the same conversation, it feels like, for a while. Let's move past it and find a way to, like, you know, the job has to still get done at the end of the day. And the two things I wanted to touch on for you, because I remember reading something, I was rereading it this morning. You know, you were writing about your experiences working, and like, you know, I'm curious the specifics behind it. You said you couldn't actually work legally until you were 25. One of your first jobs being selling car wax at gas stations, and what you learned from that. And it makes me
Yeah.
think of like I had a similar but different experience where so I've I'm in school now after the fact, but I didn't go to college. I just kind of worked my way up in the tech industry.
Yeah.
But before that, I was a chef,
Okay.
and the best
I'm
work
curious.
advice. Go ahead.
Sorry to mess up your flow. In tech, what do you do? Yeah, what do you do in tech?
Um, I work, I don't want to say too specifically, but I work like
Yep.
infrastructure, system
Okay.
admin, network engineer. So kind of
Got it. Got
background,
it.
not software engineer. But I
Got it.
think so that having been said, like I feel like that's something that's carried over, like kind of like being a chef. I like to be the
So
guy.
you're a hacker, basically.
Not no, not a hacker at all. I'm the guy who makes things work in the
Just joking.
background so that the
Got it.
hackers can
Got
do
it.
their thing.
Yep. Yep.
Kind of like being a chef. But point
Okay.
being, the best career advice I ever got was when even I think applies to my job now, even though it's very different. Is I had a head chef and he was talking about how when he was hiring people, it's like, I'd rather have somebody who had 5 years experience at Denny's rather than somebody who's straight out of culinary school,
Mm,
because there's a difference between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. Because what he told me that really stuck with me was, at the end of the day, like, you can make 200 omelets in a brunch period or you can't.
mm,
Competence is a binary, and that's something I
mm.
found interesting about your writing and your work. And I'm curious about, like, your experience in law and music production. That's something I want to touch on too, and kind of that more practical knowledge and lived experience that comes with competence in living.
Absolutely, man. You know, just touching on something you said previously, and not to rehash the
Hmm.
conversation we just had, but to kind of tie it in to where we're going. When I talk about biases, really blind spots, right?
Hmm.
Like, I'm not. I mean, I'm still in the kind of non-profit mode, so I don't want to sound like I'm grandstanding. But we just had this whole like 3 hour. I had this 3 hour talk with some guys. But for me, it's obviously I'm not perfect. None of us are perfect, but I'm not going out of my way to harm anybody, right? Or to be sexist or to demean or degrade. Um, when I say biases, I simply mean blind spots, and I think we all have them. And I think ultimately it's about having good intentions, right?
Hmm.
Trying your best to be a good person, like you said, treat others with the respect, right? Um, and in the course of doing that, sometimes your blind spots are uncovered, and you learn from it. And you say, okay, let me become and be and remain more aware as I continue, right? Um, and so for me, I think that's something that I've always tried to do. Is really learning from experiences, learning from people as well. You talked about tech, and so for me, it's been it's been like Gulliver's Travels, right?
Hmm.
You know, being in these different spaces and what you find similar to ethnic cultures. Every industry, every space, every company has its own culture. Um, and for me, it's been a learning experience. And to your point about some of these like HR programs, I think, one thing that I can say is I have had these culture shocks. And one thing that I've learned sometimes from my own mistakes is, it's important not only to bring your own culture or way of thinking or being, into spaces, but also have, I think, the humility to learn from others as well, because we don't know everything, right? And our experiences and our cultures are not the sum of the world. And especially in tech, right? I mean, I it, there's a lot of different reasonings for this, but I think less than six, maybe less than 5% of attorneys are Black. Probably fewer than half of those probably work in tech, right? And so for me, kind of navigating through these spaces, the further I've gone along, the less fewer people who look like me that I've
Hmm.
seen, right? And it's a very, I think for me, in my experiences, it's never been an uncomfortable thing. It's never been a matter of me not feeling. It's never been a matter of me feeling uncomfortable in those spaces, or necessarily feeling like I don't belong in those spaces. But I think sometimes, over the course of my career, I'm relearning, but I've had to almost build like protective armor, right?
Hmm.
A sort of defensiveness before I get into these spaces, because I know there's not going to be a lot of people who look like me in those spaces, right? And also wanting to get ahead of any preconceived notions that may that people may have about me. But what I found is um, not everyone does have those, right? And there are a
Hmm.
lot of people who are simply open. They may not know, but kind of going to what I was saying earlier, if you go in looking for some of these things, you're going to find them, right? And you're going to find them not because those individuals necessarily mean you harm, but simply because they're human, right? And so
Hmm.
sometimes it's simply having the humility to recognize, your own blind spots, right? And realize, well, others may have them too, but how do we bridge that gap, right? And so for me, like and that's a mistake that I've made, at certain points in my career. But how do I get to this place? Yeah, the not working, until I was 25. I, like you, I can't go into real details there.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That's fine.
Yeah, especially the times that we're in.
That's
But yeah,
fine. Don't say anything
but
you're not comfortable saying. I was just
yeah,
curious if you wanted to tell the story.
yeah, but it was. I mean, it was a real. It was an interesting experience. I mean, you know, one way that I can compare it to was, if we look at music. So I've worked in music law for some time. You look at there's some artists who they didn't release their albums until they were maybe 24, 25 older. And one of the benefits of that is they were able to come into an industry that is very much a business, with lived life experiences, right? They were more mature. They had gone through real things. They had a different perspective than artists who may have started out in their careers when they were 13, 14, 17, 18, etc. Very young, very impressionable. And as a result, you see many of those artists who started out when they were younger, several things happen to them, right? They may get into the business, they may get taken advantage of, right? Simply because they're not aware.
Mhm.
They may make certain mistakes. They may, be immature, impressionable. They may, make a lot of money, lose it all, right? Simply put, they often don't understand how much of a business it is, right? That the music industry is very much corporate, right? It's like any other industry. You have executives, you have HR, you have data analysts, right? You have software engineers, you have accountants, right? So you have marketing. It's these, you look at the three major industries. They're corporations. They're publicly listed, right? And so an artist who starts out very young is not going to understand that. They're just looking at the fame. They're looking at the lights and the camera and the action, and the attention of it all, but they're not actually understanding the back office of the business. I think for me, that was one of the benefits that I had, is that I was able to get some of that immaturity out of my system a bit before I started out my professional career. Um, the car washing thing, yeah, man. I mean, that's a funny story. So when I originally, I got a master's degree in public administration uh, with a focus in public policy. I wanted to go into uh, nonprofit and public sector work, but I quickly found out that the organizations that I was interested in working with, they didn't have a lot of funding. They couldn't actually achieve their aims, their goals, due to a lack of funding, and so that seemed kind of unproductive. And so I decided to make the pivot, um, to ultimately go to law school. But kind of in the midst of all of that, I got this marketing job that turned out to not really be a marketing job. We were selling car wax. And the first day, the first interview, I'm at the interview like this. I'm sitting across from the guy. I don't know if he went to college. And he says, literally, the first or second question he asked me was, "So, why do you think you're qualified for this job?" And I was so offended. I was extremely offended because I'm like, dude, we're selling car wax. Like, what qualifications do I need to sell car wax? And I'm thinking, I've gone to school. I did what I was supposed to do. It shouldn't be that serious. But over time, you learn that it's not really about uh, it's not really about, like you said, your degrees. It's not really about theoretical knowledge. It's more about practical experience, practical skills, and ability. right? Uh, yeah, I got degrees in, certain things, but it's another thing to be able to scale a business and product lines and service lines in the sales force, regardless of what you're selling. Um, and so for me, I took some of those practical lessons that I've learned, in that instance and previous life experiences, and just taking that into my career, as an attorney. And I think that's helped me a lot. It's helped me a lot because I never viewed a legal career simply from the lens of um, simply being a legal advisor. You know, I I was never content with being in a back office somewhere, and I'm a commercial attorney by practice, so mainly contracts, um, commercial agreements, corporate agreements, things of that nature. But I was never really content with just looking at papers all day. I was always interested and aware of um, the other groups and the other functions, right, that it takes to operate a business. And so for me, I always kept an eye on that. And one of the reasons why I was able to transition into tech was because, again, I started my career in music. And over time, I started seeing how, and this goes back to maybe 2013, I started working in music law my first year of law school, and just continued after that. But over time, I started seeing how software and technology were impacting the music business. Um, and I was noticing how it was affecting not only the deals that artists were signing with record labels, but it was everything downstream from that, right? The deals that they were signing with one another, whether it's producer and songwriters with artists, whether it's retainer agreements between the lawyers and these different clients. And I was just essentially saying that the money in the music business was shrinking and was moving into different places. And so for me, I made the decision very early on to begin to pivot into the software and technology sectors because of that. And some of those things were only because, in my early experiences, I just had a very visceral understanding, for better and worse, of what drives industries, right? And
Mhm.
it's not, again, like you said, it's not theoretical knowledge, it's not degrees, right? You can have all the degrees in the world and not be able to do anything with it. Not sure that that answers your question. I know I touched on some other things in that article, but for me, that's really it. And I've kind of, part of it has also been a bit. I always say I have a bit of a schizophrenic. I've had a bit of a schizophrenic career because, um, oftentimes just the way that I think capitalism and corporate America often work is you need to have a specialization and you need to do a certain thing, right? You need to be a certain cog in this machine, right? And so sometimes that can come with difficulties, especially when you operate more as a generalist. But that said, I think overall it's kind of served me well and helped me transition and pivot when I need to.
hmm No, that's great. That actually kind of touches on one of the other things I wanted to pivot to and talk about. Because you also write a lot about the music industry and artist rights. And even like, you wrote something recently about like the way business and work and is changing because of AI. And I'm really curious, and especially when you write about artist rights and companies that try to make sure artists get their own publishing and whatnot. Because if, as me as a music fan, that's a tale as old as time of an artist
Yeah.
getting screwed over by their company. So I'm curious to what you think about that as far as like artist rights and just like the technology and of how music is recorded and made / distributed is going. Because I remember watching, I don't know if you know of Rick Beato on YouTube, who talks about a lot of different stuff in the
Mm.
music business. Um, and the specific video he was talking about, like, it was like Spotify or some music company has like this thing like AI generated music now, and for the most part, it's pretty generic, pretty shitty. Maybe if it was playing on the background in, um, you're at Costco or whatever, you wouldn't notice. But this is still early in the technology, really. So I'm interested to see where that's going to go. Like, if an artist has their back catalog sold and, the Beatles or, Tupac or, any of these artists who are dead, now you can like potentially generate quote unquote new music by them. And I'm curious to see your thoughts on where all of this is going because it seems like it's in your wheelhouse.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, huge questions, man. I think simple answer, quick answer, easy answer. I don't think anyone knows where
Hmm.
this AI thing is headed fully, especially as it relates to music, media, entertainment. I think that there's a confluence of things happening. Um, where I'll start is I think fundamentally for artists and creators, the number one thing I think to understand is that uh, there are property rights associated with your work. I think I posted this on Substack some time ago, and I'm always deleting my posts, but I said something to the effect of many artists, many creators would be better off if they viewed their work as real estate in addition to art, because I think that when you look at it like that, not only is that actually very much how it works, I think there's a certain level of there's a different mode of operation that you probably conduct yourself when you view it in that way. Um, and it's important because there are property rights associated with work, right? With creative work, copyrights in general. Copyright is defined as a tangible. It's defined as an original and creative work that's fixed in a tangible medium of expression. That's the legalese behind it. And what it does is it grants creators certain rights. It grants you the right to prevent anyone from distributing your work without your permission, reproducing your work without your permission, creating derivatives without your permission. A derivative could be an AI Tupac hologram, right?
Hmm.
Maybe that uses right his songs and all of these things. And so it grants you, there's 6 different rights that it grants to creators, and it gives you protection, right? It also gives you, it entitles you to certain statutory royalties if we're discussing music. And so fundamentally there are rights associated with the works of artists. And so that's kind of why I had an issue with, I saw Jack Dorsey tweeted delete IP law, which I
Mm.
thought, he said delete IP law, which I thought was the craziest thing in the world because this company literally just bought Title, right? If there's no IP law, then Title doesn't, well, Title could still make money, but the artists on Title won't make any money because now there's nothing to prevent me from, copying every single artist that's distributed through Title, copying their work and selling it or, distributing it myself, right? And so
Mhm.
I thought that was a strange thing to say. Um, when it comes to AI, it's a loaded question. Fundamentally, I don't think. All right, fundamentally, I think that the nature of the entertainment industry is such that there's a Harvard professor, I can't remember her name, but she wrote a book called, I think, Blockbusters. And that book essentially covers the statistics in the entertainment industry, and it shows how there's a small percentage of entertainers or creators that essentially, I don't want to say take all the spoils, right? But
Mhm.
that over index, right? In software in Silicon Valley, they talk about power law, right? Which is that there's a small subset of companies, right? If you look at the companies, the startups that venture capitalists have invested into, a small percentage, maybe 5 or 6%, um, have have uh, what's the word? Have achieved unicorn status, right? Are profitable, have gone public, and these are the companies, these are the artists that essentially subsidize everyone else. So to bring it back to the music industry, Drake, Taylor Swift, Kendrick Lamar, Chaperone, Ed Sheeran, these artists subsidize every other artist that's signed to the major record labels, right? Because 90%, maybe 95% of the artists that signed to these record labels will not achieve the commercial success that these other artists have, right? And fundamentally, that's how the entertainment industry, music industry, especially has um, largely operated. Now, I think we live in an age where, and I know Substack is, this is one of the missions of Substack. We live in an age where access to consumers is being democratized, right? So, whereas in the past, 99% of artists had no shot right, of reaching their target
Hmm.
consumers. Now you can create a social media page, you can create a Substack, you can create a Bandcamp, you can distribute your music uh, sometimes for free, right? You can reach the masses in a way that artists in the past haven't, right? And so I think a lot of the pushback against companies like Spotify and Apple Music and even AI, I think that often glosses over some of the capabilities that technology has given to artists and creators today. Now, it doesn't mean that it's perfect, but I think it's a much better system than we previously had. As it relates to AI, I think for me, I think the main concern and the main conflict there is this debate over whether or not training LLMs on copyrighted material, again, that has these copyright protections, whether that constitutes copyright infringement. Um, and it functions in two parts: the training of that copyrighted material, but also the output of these LLMs. And that's an ongoing debate. There are many cases currently going through the courts. There are some instances where courts have ruled. Specifically, there was a case that Reuters, which is like a company that provides legal resources, case briefs, dockets for lawyers. There was a company that trained on their data and essentially replicated it through their LLMs. Court case recently ruled that that did not that constituted copyright infringement. The argument that many AI companies make is that it's fair use. And so that's an ongoing debate and argument. How it's going to be settled, we'll see. I mean, there are good arguments on both sides. I think that it's going to come out in a few ways. I think that we're going to see a lot of licensing agreements between the large media companies and some of these AI companies. I think we've already seen that. I think over time there's going to be some sort of licensing or royalty mechanism that's created, because I just don't think that over time AI companies are going to be able to consistently scrape and train on copyrighted material for free, for nothing.
Hmm.
I think that's going to shake out in some way. Again, some people, James Cameron, for example, James Cameron, and I'll kind of wrap it up. James Cameron, the director of what is it, Avatar, right?
Hmm.
Um,
And Titanic was the other
and
big one.
and Titanic. I watched an interview of him, and he was basically making the argument that he's not concerned about the training of the data or the copyrighted material as he is the output, right? And so he said that creators and people in general, lawyers included, should be more concerned about whether the output is infringing on someone's copyright. That is, whether it's substantially similar to someone's copyrighted material. And he used, which I thought was an interesting argument. He basically said that these LLMs function very similarly to our brains, right? So
Hmm.
any artist or any individual, you're constantly receiving input from different sources, right? What's the great quote? Good artists copy, great artists steal, right?
Hmm.
So you're a fan of music. Musicians are routinely drawing inspiration from different artists, different musicians constantly, and they're incorporating that into their work, right? And so I might listen to a James Brown song, and I might listen to a David Bowie song, and I might put the two together and come up with something different, right? It may have elements of each of these artists, but the output is substantially different. And so James Cameron's argument was that that's what we should be more concerned about, because you know regardless of AI, we're always going to draw inspiration and material from different sources. I don't know if everyone's going to agree with that, but I do see the logic there. But again, to sum it up, I do think over time, whether or not everyone is going to be eligible for this, I think there's going to be some sort of licensing or royalty mechanism that's incorporated in the way that AI deals with copyrighted material. There is a startup out there. It's called Tollbit, Tollbit. I know they're working on something similar to facilitate the licensing of copyrighted material um, to these AI companies. So I think we're going to see some advancements there. But overall, for me, I don't think that that's the biggest impediment to an artist or a creator's success today. I think the biggest challenge is simply the amount of content I know people. There's a one of my Substack friends, Miter. I think he might hate the word uh, content, but
Hmm.
the amount of material that's out there, right? I think that's the biggest challenge in that, and I think that's only going to increase with AI because now it's making it easier. You talked about the AI generated music. It's making it easier for everyone to create. And one thing I always tell artists personally is that you know, when we talk about competition in the sense of alternatives, um, musicians and artists and creators. Well, let's take musicians. They're not only competing with other musicians; they're competing with TikTokers. They're competing with social media influencers. They're competing with Substack writers. They're competing with people who are drawing attention from the consumer because now everyone has access to these same platforms. And so when we talk about AI, uh, AI is simply giving everyone the ability to create um, more easily, right? Um, and ultimately, I do think that I saw a great quote that AI is going to improve the capabilities of, um, let's say, I don't want to use the word mediocre, but it's going to increase the capability of average people, but it's also going to increase the capability of the best, right? As far as what they do, their craft, right? And so
Hmm.
again, just to kind of sum it up, I don't think personally that AI is the biggest challenge for creators. I think it does challenge certain industries for sure. Similarly to how the internet disrupted the news industry, magazines, newspapers, right? And now we have Substack, right? So I think we're always going to see these disruptions and evolutions. But for me, I'm not too concerned about it in the sense that I fear for artists or creators. I think there are a lot bigger challenges. I do think there are some legal and probably business issues to be solved. Um, but if I was a recording artist today, AI wouldn't be um, my biggest concern personally. That's my personal view.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff there you said to dig into. Um, but first and foremost, the thing that really makes me think of is other than like the legal side of it, which is something I think you touched on pretty well. I was talking to somebody else on Substack the other day that like there's a lot of, what do they call it online, doomerism of in certain industries, like myself working in the tech world or you working in the legal world. I feel like we've probably heard a lot of conversations about how there will be no lawyers by 2030, there will no be tech people by 2030, which to me, on a technical level, like I feel like the joke I make a lot is when you read discourse about AI or LLMs, you could just like do a control F, find, copy, replace AI and replace it with Angry Wizard, just like it, because it could be anything. Like, but
Yep,
at the
yep.
same time, like when you're talking about, and I don't want to misspeak here because this is more your domain, but like legal advice, you could, have an LLM that can get legal advice for something that's very, very basic. Like,
Yep.
I don't think I'm necessarily, because a couple years ago I had to take legal action against a landlord, and I, had like a 30-minute conversation that cost me hundred some odd dollars. Or now I could have been like, okay, I can have an LLM that can tell me what the law is so I can move forward, much in the same way that,
Yep.
okay, you could probably use AI if you're a smart person, if you're having a computer issue, if you know how to ask the right questions, you can have have Chat GPT help you with it. That
Yep.
having been said, I do think, and you touched on this, I think right now we are in the golden age of free slash cheap, very robust large language models for the reason that you said of it's just too new of a technology and there's not a lot of legal precedent set for it.
Mm.
To me, it feels almost like the early days of streaming services like Netflix, what have you. 10, 15 years ago, Netflix was basically the only game in town. And they, because companies like, yeah, will for a pittance they can license out their own shows and make some extra revenue. But as it became more popular, now we have it's a hack joke now that there's more streaming services now than when there was cable. We've reinvented cable. So
Mm.
I could
Yep.
see
Yep.
things going that direction as things become more monetized and there's more legal action taken. Or even like I don't know if you've ever heard of there's a guy named Jaron Lanier. He's like a tech writer. He coined the phrase that you've probably heard: if a service is free, then you're the product. And
Absolutely.
he talks about something like, he calls it digital data dignity, where even for something like Substack or Reddit, Twitter, I guess X now, having an opt-in thing or an opt-out for whether or not an LLM can be trained on user-generated data, and if you opt in, like a payment scheme. So I do think in some ways people are a little bit too. I think you do need, especially if you work in certain fields, you should like be mindful of it, watch the way the technology is going, watch the way the laws are going. But I do
Yeah.
think some people are a little too doomer. But with the other thing that you said that made me think about was the music side and the creative side. You probably saw recently, all across Substack media, the Studio Ghibli trend.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and I know like Miyazaki, the creator of it, was very against it, and understandably so. But the metaphor that I had for that makes me think about is if you saw, back in the 90s, they had the Napster thing, right?
Yep.
And the Lars Ulrich of Metallica kind of led that charge. To me, it kind of feels like that, where I think if you are a large enough artist, if you're, if you can say, hey, make me have an AI program that's trained on all these songs. Hey, make me a Metallica song. If you're a big enough artist where you have the recognizability and the body of work and success that you can even, do that successfully, you're probably going to be okay. Much in the same way, if you're a big enough artist, then it's like Studio Ghibli or Pixar or what have you. You're probably going to be okay. The thing that does worry me, but I think you touched on it, was interesting, is it's going to be harder for newer artists to maybe be able to break into that pack, because you can have, I saw like last year a Beatles song, an unreleased Beatles song that was finished with AI, won a Grammy, which to me, like, get out of the way. These guys have had, 50, 60 years of success. But at the same time, I could see there's more of a democratization that could happen, and I'm especially interested in your perspective as a music producer, because I write in not the best quality of all time, but like write and produce music for myself. I've done it for my friends' bands in the past. I'm trying to get back into it, but just like as but this is more for the audience. Like, recording music used to be an extremely expensive, extremely time consuming, and you needed to have like a really specific skill set. And
Yep.
now it is much, much easier, much, much cheaper. Like I have, I bought a little like Focusrite audio interface box, a couple microphones, a couple amps, some instruments for under $1,000 now. And like, a program like Reaper is a free, they call it, a DAW, digital audio workstation. It's like $80, and I can do something that would have been like professional studio quality, as early as like, 20, 30 years ago. So I'm interested to see how, you were talking about, maybe it's not a nice thing to say, but, more mediocre artists. But I also think the other side of that would be people who don't have the resources to make something big. They have this creativity, and they can use, hey, like I have my guitar part that I wrote, put in the drums in this tempo, the guitar part, whatever your genre is. So I'll be
Yep.
interested to see how that goes about, because I think it's going to be a very democratizing thing, even more so for better and for worse.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I think for me, I always cringe when you include me in that music production conversation, because it's something I haven't done in a long time. It's something I was
Mhm.
doing while I was in college.
Oh, I see.
On Fruity Loops and
That
all of
takes me
that. And
back.
yeah, and definitely would not put myself in the conversation of, like, there's another guy on Substack. I've actually someone I've worked with, Drew,
Mhm.
who's produced for numerous artists. But I think for me, one thing that those experiences um, have given me is able to see the creative side as well as the legal and business side as well. Um, And I think when we talk about the creativity and that work, I think what oftentimes goes underappreciated is the work that many artists and producers had to put in previous eras, right? So if we look at Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones, for example, who produced Thriller, they recorded hundreds of songs. I want to say 700, but you can fact check me, or someone can fact check me. But um, specifically, hundreds of songs, right? They recorded hundreds of songs for that album, and I want to say they only picked eight, right? It's like 8 to 10 songs on the Thrill album. So if you just think about the amount of, and they had multiple session musicians, you know, um, several contributors. So if you think about the amount of work that it took to create an album with only 8 to 10 songs, right? It's though I don't think those principles change. Jimmy Iovine has a great quote about how, artists would work on an album for a year before releasing it. And so I think to the point of the democratization of music and kind of the lowering of the bar of entry, what it's done is it's a double-edged sword. It's great in that it's allowed people who previously couldn't access some of these things, these tools, these markets, funding, to be able to access it. But I think also what it's done as well is, in many ways, and it's not even just music, I think in general, we've often lost sight of um, some of these underlying principles that don't change, right? Like I mentioned earlier, some of the, what I appreciate about some of your writing is, some of the historical facts and stories and perspectives that you talk about, right? And if I'm not my brother's actually a history buff. I'm not. I more so just kind of see trends and things like that. But when we look in history and we see some of the great things that people accomplished with significantly less resources and technological capability, it's impressive, right? And to the point about some of these conversations being a waste of time, I think that's why it's a waste of a waste of time, right? Because we're only here because of what previous generations have accomplished. And so for me, the question is always, okay, how do we apply some of those principles? We may do it now with technology or in different ways or for different aims, but some of these underlying principles don't fundamentally change. And so the AI conversation, looking at the studio Ghibli thing. I mean, to be honest, man, my first impression, it kind of left uh, a bad taste in my mouth just on first impression, because thinking from the artist's perspective, this is a guy, and to be honest, I don't know how much everyone knew about him, but I didn't really know anything about him until I kind of looked into his story and saw him and those kind of things. But to just think, wow, overnight, this guy's work that probably took him decades to refine and develop is just everywhere,
Mhm.
right? And so I'm like, ugh. But on the other hand, I think the only thing that's changed, or that's different, is just the ease of access, how easy it is for people to kind of replicate his style, which, by the way, is not necessarily copyrightable, right? Um, and so I don't think that replication is anything new, right? You talked about Metallica. I mean, if you look at music, right, it's always been the case. There's a great music documentary. It's called The British Invasion. And it talks about, I think this was the 60s and 70s, when there was just an invasion of bands from Britain or England, UK, into America. And what happens in the music industry is a particular sound or style breaks through, then everyone rushes to copy it, right? And so even though you had all of these British bands, very few actually lasted, right? Of course, the Beatles,
Mhm.
it talks about the Monkees, but very few actually lasted, which again goes to the point of there's something beyond just being able to copy another style that's required for sustained success, right? There's more heart and soul and perspective and lived experience that goes into certain things. But in the music industry, the way that it functions is there's a sound, whether it's jazz, whether it's, you look at like the pop era of the 2000s where you had, I don't know if it was a Britney Spears clone or she was a clone of other artists. So you
Mhm.
had multiple artists that sounded the same, right? You had Britney Spears, you had Jessica Simpson, you had Christina Aguilera, you had all of these artists with the same type of sound, but it's because it's working. And so there was a rush to emulate that, right? I mean, you see the same thing in rap and rock and all of these different things. So the music industry, creative industries have always functioned like that, I think. Um, but now with AI, the only difference is it's easier for people to do it. And I think that there's a big difference, again, to the point, there's a big difference in being able to replicate a style and being able to scale it, right? All right, everyone can create a studio. Is it Ghibli or Ghibli?
I honestly don't know. I've said Ghibli, but it might not be right. I've
I
only
have no
read it.
idea. So there, but the point is, it's one thing for me to be able to create, you know, images in that style. It's another thing for me to enjoy the opportunities that the original creator
Mhm.
enjoys, right? Because it's just different, right? So for me, I think it's the same. I think when you posted that, I responded with a Leonardo da Vinci quote, right? And uh, he said, life is that, you know, you try some things, most of them fail, some works. If it works big, people copy it, and then you do something else. And the trick is into doing something else, right? And
Mhm.
so this is, Leonardo da Vinci, probably one of the greatest artists. So yeah, I think from a creative standpoint, from an artist standpoint, it's like I don't like seeing my work just copied or replicated that easily. But I think if you zoom out and you kind of look at the history of these fields and just the world in general, then you kind of understand that, all right, it's not really about simply being able to replicate something, right? There are other qualities involved in that. Um, that are required for that sustained success. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but another aspect of AI that people don't talk about is not even the training on copyrighted work per se, but it's, you look at Spotify, and the way that Spotify works is that artists don't actually get paid a per stream royalty. It's actually more of a pro rata um, payment structure, meaning that they get paid based on their uh, percentage of the overall volume of music streams, right?
Mhm.
Which now breaks down into you can assign a royalty per stream rate to that, but it's actually based on a pro rata, their pro rata share of the overall volume. And so that's why there's now a bunch of pushback, and sometimes by the record labels against AI music or AI generated music on the platforms, because what it does is it decreases the amount of royalties that are paid to the labels and their artists, right?
Mm.
I mean, there's an article. It was in the Wall Street Journal that covered what's the guy's name? Uh, Lucian Grange's son. So Lucian Grange is the CEO of Universal Music Group. I can't remember his son's first name, but I believe he's now the CEO of Warner. Is it Warner or Atlantic? It's the same company. But anyway, he essentially said that it's not right that an AI generated song or an AI generated artist is paid the same amount as Ed Sheeran, right? And so you're starting to see a lot of pushback in that regard. Some of these companies are actually working on their own social media platforms. Really, I think that's one of the biggest misses by the music industry, the fact that they didn't develop their own, music streaming platforms.
Mhm.
Even though they did get equity in Spotify, but um,
MySpace tried, but that was about it.
yeah, this is out of my depth, but I read an article. Maybe you know this, but I read an article about essentially how Google destroyed MySpace, uh, right, and how it wasn't really because of a lack of active users, but more so that Google essentially redirected traffic from MySpace.
Hmm.
Something to that effect. I may be off, um, but yeah, man. So for me, I think that's what it is, right? I think ultimately, again, I'm not the super artist or creator, but ultimately, I think that the best creators are not worried about AI per se, but to the point, I do think that what it's doing is it's lowering the bar of entry. It's creating the volume of, quote unquote content that's in the marketplace. Uh, but I think that, artists and creators should also remain aware of some of these underlying principles. Like, again, literally, for one of the highest selling albums of all time, Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson recorded hundreds of songs just to release a few. Right.
Mhm.
So this technology it doesn't eliminate the need for work. It doesn't eliminate the need for intentionality. It doesn't eliminate the need for quality and marketing and all of these other things. That they're still there. Right. And so if you only focus on how easy it is to create and put it out there, I think it's why Spotify now has a category that they call professional artists, right? Meaning that you have a certain number of you're earning a certain amount of money and you have a certain number of streams, right? Because what the stats show is that I can't remember the percentage, but a great number of artists who have released music on Spotify have released less than 10 songs. I wish I would have pulled the specific stat, but a lot of people are hobbyists, right?
Mhm.
And so I think again, people who are serious about being an artist or a creator, I think you do have to, and this is not to take away or to minimize it, but I do think that we all need to remember some of these underlying principles and the work ethic, right, and the approach that some of the most successful artists and creators had through time. Technology, AI, it doesn't eliminate that at all, and I think that's probably one of the that's a delusion, right? In addition to the doomerism, I think that's it. Doomerism and delusion, right? I think
Mhm.
those are both qualities of this AI age that we're living in.
Yeah. Well, no, I think you hit on some really good stuff there because at least to me at this point, like maybe it's just in my nature. I'm just kind of a contrarian person sometimes, but also just understanding how the technology works. That I feel like a lot of people have a very like reactionary stance toward it,
Oh
which
yeah.
at least to me it makes sense to a certain degree, right? Because to me, AI generated is now synonymous with like low effort.
Mm,
So, I mean, I think if you're a really good artist, you don't have to worry. Maybe if you're in the creative field of like graphic design, you're understandably worried, but I think you can
yeah.
utilize that. But I think you hit the nail on the head really well when you're talking about the recording of Michael Jackson's Thriller. Because I'm a big music fan myself, and I just watched this documentary. Funnily enough, I think called Sidemen or something
Okay.
like that, and it's talking about a documentary about studio musicians who you know they're maybe not necessarily getting the limelight, but these people
Mm,
who put in thousands and thousands of hours, specifically the guy, Steve Lukather was
mm,
the guitar player who worked on Beat It, and it was the band Toto who did all the music for that one specifically. And these were all guys who had been playing hundreds and hundreds of hours, working with all these different artists for, 10, 15 years before you got that call. Like if you're
mm.
getting, for people who are not as much of a music buff, like Quincy Jones is like considered one of the best producers of all time. And if you're
Absolutely.
getting a call from Quincy Jones, that means you're the best of the best of the best. And that's kind of the thing that's a silver lining to me is that like if you are truly really creative, um, it's not something you necessarily have to worry about. People steal your style, but that happens regardless, right? Because you're
Yep.
talking about the British invasion, these are bands that were inspired by American artists a lot of the times.
Yep.
And there's a conversation about giving credit and whatnot. Like a band like Led Zeppelin was famous for, shall we say, being maybe a little bit too liberal with use of their influences. Some people say plagiarism. Also the other side being it was not uncommon at the time, as you probably know, to like take a traditional song and give yourself writing credit if it's like some old country or blues song. But
Yep.
that's
Yep.
neither here nor there. But these are
Yep.
people who all put in all the hours and worked really hard. You can't just be it because you can't just go to Chat GPT, Grok, what have you, say, hey, create me a brand new song. And while every human has influences by its very nature, AI is working from things that already exist,
Yep.
and it's not ever going to be created the same way. Much in the same way, you can't say, "Come up with an app for me," because they're by its very nature, the technology, it's only taking things that already exist. So I think it could be interesting to augment people who are already talented. One of the things I was thinking about is like if you're say an artist in like a visual artist and you want to make a an animated film or a cartoon, you could draw and create like the character models and everything like that, and the sets, what have you, and then have like an LLM do the what essentially boils down to grunt work, because if the actual work of animating, like at least in like a 3D environment, it's a lot more like coding and modeling than it is like drawing. Like an initial artist does that. So it's and obviously there's problems with that too, but I think it's an interesting time to live in with how this technology is going to how it's going to shake down. And I think I was talking to somebody, a guy named Dimitri who writes about this type of thing as well, and he kind of said what you said. If you are a creative and talented person, AI can amplify you tenfold. If you're uncreative and untalented, because much in the same way you were talking about in Spotify, they're just basically spamming generic. Maybe if it gets thrown in a playlist, if you have it on shuffle, you may or may
Yep.
not listen. But I feel like not a lot of people are going to seek that out, much in the same way that like in the writing space, you could say, hey, Substack, or not Substack, ChatGPT, give me 10,000 words on AI and creativity. And you might get some views, but I feel like it's just going to be generic by its very nature. But that having been said, it's kind of like if I take steroids versus if LeBron James takes steroids, like
Yep.
we're not working with the same base model, So
Yep.
It'll be interesting to see. So I guess I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I want to know if you have any closing thoughts on that. Then we'll do plugs and promotions. And
No, I think that's great, man. And I absolutely agree, right? I think that it's and again, it probably depends on the domain, right? I'm not a software engineer, so I can't speak to this vibe coding uh, movement, or the use of AI uh, to develop software. I can't speak to that, but I do think that it's a mistake to only depend on AI, right? I think there's a human quality, uh, creativity, ingenuity, that's valuable, right? And I do agree that it can be used, AI can be used in tandem with that, right? But I do think it's a mistake to kind of give up our own human agency. Um, I also think that, because again, going back to the point, the way that AI is very interesting because the way that these LLMs have been developed, to my understanding, is heavily based or inspired by the way that our brains work, right? If I understand it right. And so going back to the earlier point, the impact of influence, right, and inspiration on our creativity, that's a human thing. We've always done that, right? Like the examples that you were giving, and I talked about, right, the pop era in the 2000s, and talked about Britney Spears, but she was also inspired by Janet Jackson, right? And Janet Jackson was inspired by somebody, and that person was inspired by somebody, but they kind of added their own twist to it. I always use Michael Jackson as an example because he was as much of an entertainer, but he was also very shrewd business wise, right? Like he acquired the Beatles catalog, and at one time he owned half of the largest music publishing company in the world, right? But even besides that, one thing that he always did is he always moved with the trending sounds, right, of his day, right? So he might have started out in the Motown era, transitioned into disco, right? Then he transitioned into R&B, right? He transitioned into funk, even going all the way up to the 90s. He was releasing New Jack Swing, right? Songs released by Teddy Riley, who produced for who produced for Bobby Brown, right, and other artists in the 90s. So Michael Jackson had this keen ability of drawing inspiration and influence from different eras. He was inspired by James Brown, right? So he drew inspiration and influence from these different eras that he found a way to kind of make it his own. And so ultimately, I think that's a good degree of the promise of AI. I mean, as an attorney, you use the example of being able to consult AI for basic things, and I mean, I agree with that. I remember even as far back as maybe 2012, 15, seeing that, look, you can get an NDA online, right? So there's certain things that people just would not go to attorneys for. And maybe, if they could confirm that it was legit, didn't need to, right? And this is before AI really became a thing. And so I personally, I don't see anything wrong with that. I do think it's going to disrupt a lot of, let's say, lower effort work and work product. And I do think it's going to require, lawyers and maybe other fields to simply do more, or to, look into, okay, how can I use AI to ramp up my service offerings, right? To become better. And I think that's a necessity. I think every lawyer is gonna, and other professions are gonna have to do that. But I also think that, there's certain things that AI can't replace. And it's just important not to lose sight of that. I was also trying to find the stat, because it was bugging me about Spotify. So I looked it up on Google Gemini, and so the stat actually is that 2.35% of artists on Spotify have released more than 10 tracks and have an average of at least 10,000 monthly listeners.
Oh, wow.
Now I was trying to find the number of artists, because you can't, to a degree, you can't really control how many listeners you have. I was trying to find the stat on how many have released over 10 tracks by itself. I can't find that, but that just kind of gives you an example of why Spotify and the record labels take the stance, right, and are shifting gears in the way that they are, because they're simply, one thing that I learned about, whether you call it Silicon Valley or tech companies or other businesses, is that to a large degree they're simply just looking at data, right? They're looking at data and they're forecasting and they're making decisions based on that. And so oftentimes people feel very offended, and maybe rightfully so, but oftentimes, these companies and the decision makers, it's very often that they don't have actual lived experience in the fields themselves, right? Many of them are not artists, but what they are is, individuals that can read data, right, and can make business decisions based on what the data is telling them. And so that's just an incredible stat to me. Another stat is, hundreds of, I think it's over 100,000 songs at this point. It might be more if I'm not mistaken, but over 100,000 songs are released on Spotify every single day, right? And so for me, the biggest challenge for creators and artists is not AI per se. It's really, I think to a large degree, it's a marketing problem. It's an attention problem. It's a byproduct of, again, just the barriers of entry being lowered and how much volume is in the market. It's a huge topic. But for me, I think if someone is really, I always use the word and the concept of purposed, right? If it's something that you really believe that you're purposed to do, I think it's just about, again, drawing some of these inspirations from people who have done it and applying some of those principles into your own work, whether that's from AI, whether that's just reading a book or reading a Substack article or documentary or whatever. But it's definitely challenging times, interesting times. Personally, I think if you're a creator, if you're an artist, really anyone, this is probably one of the best times to be alive. But I think we're all kind of adapting to this new reality and trying to adjust, lawyers included.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll have it made me think of one closing little anecdote that I think illustrates what you're saying really well, and then we'll do all the less fun plugs and promotions. You know the band Chic, big in the
Yep.
disco era. So
Yep.
I remember Nile Rodgers, their guitar player and producer. For me, he's like maybe my top favorite guitar players, top three of all time. Because for listeners who don't know, like all I need to do is go freak out, and you know
Yep.
exactly who I'm talking about.
Yep.
And he did so much great stuff in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s, and had kind of a resurgence and worked with bands like Daft Punk and Lizzo more recently. But the story that really struck me about him is they have this song called "Everybody Dance." It goes, "Everybody dance, do 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 do," and he was talking to Bernard Shaw, who was the bass player, and he's when they were writing the song, is like, well, what does do 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 mean? And then the next day they go to the disco and they see everybody dancing to it, and going wild for that. And it's like, yep, that's what the do do
That's
do
what it
do
means.
means. Yep, exactly. Those are those little intangibles that I don't think you can ever teach and replicate. That's I think the human element that we're always going to have and want. So that having been said,
Yep.
I really appreciate you coming on. Do you have any plugs, promotions, stuff coming up you want everybody to look out for it? And if you're not already, everybody in the audience, go ahead and subscribe to Elijah. He does some really cool stuff. Really, one of my favorite people to read. He's always very insightful. But if you have anything coming up in the nearest future, let me know.
Thank you, man. Thank you, man. And not to add more, or steal your thunder, but you just brought up a great memory. So if you watch the James Brown documentary, there's a great scene where he's asking his session musicians, his bands, to play a song and to play certain musical compositions in certain parts and certain notes, and they're struggling because what he's asking them to do is so unorthodox. And one of his band members says, "I can't play this. It's not music, right? It's not traditional. It's not what I learned in music school." And so James Brown goes, or actually the actor Chadwick Boseman, playing James Brown, he says, "Does it sound good?" And everybody says, "Yeah." And then he says, "Does it feel good?" And everybody says, "Yeah." And he says, "Then it's music." If it sounds good, if it
Absolutely.
feels good, then it's musical, right? And I think that's, to your point, just in closing, that's the human element, that quirk, that thing that AI can't replicate. In terms of plugs, no real plugs. I mean, I would love to connect with anyone interested. Sometimes I'm not as consistent on Substack in my writing, but if you would like to get in contact with me just to talk, or if you work in the media or tech space, could ever use a listening ear or some legal advice in that space, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Elijah Adefope, last name Adefope. First name Elijah, Elijah. You can also reach me on Gmail, same name, Elijah Adefope at gmail.com. I appreciate the time, BJ.
No
BJ, thank
problem.
you, man.
Well, I always want to say, I always have one little ending question that I do. I feel is always nice. So I think we got into some good stuff today. But what's something that makes you feel hopeful for the future? Or if you don't have anything specific, what's something that would?
I think what makes me hopeful, despite all of the noise and the activity and seeming chaos that is often happening in our time, I think what makes me hopeful is that in the midst of it all, you do see people questioning, right? You see people questioning, you see people still reaching out to find commonalities with one another. You see people still looking to do the right things, looking to make things better, right? Regardless of their field, right? Whether that's politics, whether that's technology, whether that's education. I think that's hopeful. That makes me hopeful when you see people striving to make things better, either for themselves or for society in general. And then besides that, besides the touchy feely stuff, what makes me hopeful is just technology. To be honest, if you'd have asked me 20 years ago if I would be working, in the technology sector, I would have thought you were crazy, right? So just seeing how technology is advancing, and not just the advancement for advancement's sake, but also what it enables us to do as people, that makes me truly hopeful. And my hope is that we find ways to use technology in ways that benefit us and not just distract us. So again, I appreciate your time, man.
Yeah, anytime. Well, I appreciate it. You have a good one, buddy.
Absolutely. You too.